So hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the Department of Art History operates. Indigenous people have shaped the history of this land over thousands of years. On this land, they have developed distinct languages, cultures, economies, and ways of life. And this land remains a sacred gathering place for many peoples of Turtle Island, and we show respect for this today. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Charmaine Nelson as our third speaker in this new series. And the aim of the series is to help transcend our various period and area specializations and act as a venue for the department as a whole to come together and discuss the past, current, and future contours of the discipline globally. Professor Nelson is Canada Research Chair in Transatlantic Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement at NSCAD University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she is also the founding director of the first ever Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery. Her research and teaching interests include post-colonial and Black feminist scholarship, transatlantic slavery studies, and Black diaspora studies. She previously taught at Mcgill from 2003 to 2020, and she took her PhD from the University of Manchester in the UK. She has authored a number of books, and I'll just mention a few of them here. The Color of Stone, Sculpting the Black Female Subject in 19th Century America from 2007. Representing the Black Female Subject in Western Art from 2010. And Slavery, Geography, and Empire in 19th Century Marine Landscapes of Montreal and Jamaica from 2016. And today she will talk to us on Black body politics and self-care, slave dress as resistance in Caribbean and Canadian slavery. So over to you, Charmaine. Thank you very much for joining us and presenting to us. So.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I very much appreciate it. And I'd like to thank Professors Knappett and Harney for the invitation, and to Christina Matevsky for all of her hard work in getting me virtually to you, and Nicholas Westbridge for the tech support. So thank you all. Thank you all for attending. I know there's other things you could be doing, so I appreciate it. And I appreciate your feedback and questions at the end. I'll just point out too, I'm going to use the quite horrible colonial terms that I find in the archive, things like Negro and Negro mulatto, especially I do so especially in the Canadian context, because I think we need a reckoning with slave history as our own history in Canada. And we need to understand that the types of archival documents that I'll be talking about and types of art are also Canadian. So I'll jump in now. Let's see here. Okay, oh, no, I want to do. Okay, so I'll just go for it. And if you, for some reason, can't hear me or can't see me, if someone could tell me. Okay, otherwise I'll assume that we're okay.
Yeah, we can see the presentation. It's great.
Yeah, thank you so much. So while living in the Caribbean island of St. Vincent, the Anglo-Irish Special Magistrate, John Colthurst, participated in the deliberate humiliation of an enslaved woman named Dutchess. Colthurst's diary recounts his encounter with Dutchess in a crowded local courtroom, where people had gathered to hear the details of her supposed crimes. The theft of money with which she purchased an array of beautiful items of dress. Her alleged misdeeds call us to contemplate several interconnected domains of transatlantic slavery, and more specifically, the experiences of the enslaved people of African descent. These domains include the study of slave dress, cultural preservation, and self-determination. But none of these can be fully understood outside of the intersecting web of sex, gender, and racial identities within the peculiar institution as slavery was known. The first domain, slave dress, entails a contemplation of how the enslaved acquired the means and materials to adorn, protect, and beautify their bodies in the midst of endemic material deprivation, cultural prohibitions, economic disenfranchisement, and pervasive physical violence. Given these forces, the second domain, cultural preservation, was never within the full control of the enslaved, but rather their ability to preserve or adapt their African cultural practices were ostensibly dictated by outside forces within a society dominated by whites. Therefore, the third domain, self-determination, was neither an individual nor a community right, but a constant point of resistance and struggle. While Dutchess's clothing acts were a demonstration of her resistance, her court appearance was a retaliatory ordeal at the hands of a violent white legal system that defined enslaved people as chattel. And chattel, another term for chattel under the law is movable personal property, like the desk I'm sitting in front of and the chair I'm sitting on. But taken together, they are my starting point for a comparison of slave dress in tropical, slave majority sites like the Caribbean islands of St. Vincent and Jamaica, and temperate slave minority sites like Canada. The latter, or Canada, has not fully become a significant focus for the study of slave dress is not due to a dearth in the archives, but rather a facet of the lack of trained scholars pursuing the study of Canadian slavery, especially from disciplinary perspectives that center art and material and visual cultures. As both a focus of control by slave owners and of resistance by the enslaved, slave dress reveals its significance as a site of contestation, as well as private pleasures and self-care and public cultural expression, preservation, and transformation. Accused of stealing money, not for basic sustenance and self-preservation, but for beautification, self-care, and what could be called pleasure, Dutchess was charged with using her supposedly ill-gotten gains to purchase elegant clothing. As Colhurst asserted, the items included wearing apparel fine enough for a princess. Their colors vied with those of the rainbow. First, a flaming bright yellow bonnet, flashy dresses without number, necklaces and earrings without end, rose-colored silk stockings, and 2 pairs of pink satin shoes. Notably, the desire for luxurious articles of dress appeared all the more ridiculous to upper-class white sensibilities when the intended wearers were enslaved field laborers, described by the 19th century observer of slavery, J. Hastings, as, quote, ladies who toil under burning sun 6 days of the week, women described as big hulking negresses with woolly locks and hoof-like feet, end quote. While Dutchess's desire for fine apparel humanizes her for today's audience, for the 19th century white citizens who packed the courthouse to gloat at her humiliation, the desire to transcend her enslaved status and to adorn her body in ways that acknowledged her beauty was, as the scholar Rebecca Earle has noted, incongruous at best or repellent at worst. Clearly, Blacks, whether enslaved or free, were certainly aware of the class mobility, however tenuous or contentious, that clothing could provide. Histories of slave resistance through escape often center around the dramatic alteration of the enslaved person's clothing as an attempt to transform the perception of their identity from enslaved to free person. Earle notes that in parts of Spanish colonized America and the Caribbean, race was not just determined by corporeal traits like skin color and hair texture, but by wealth, cultural identification, and social status as reflected in practices like dress. Thus, within the realm of law, individuals sought to establish their racial classification by demonstrating that they wore certain dress appropriate to their claimed social status. Specifically, throughout the Spanish Empire, the legal processes known as gracias al sacar and auto sobre declaratoria de mestizo, available throughout the 18th century, provided pathways for the official alteration of racial identity, opening previously restricted access to careers and activities reserved for, quote, legitimately born individuals of so-called clean blood, end quote. In one such case, in 1686, a man named Blas de Horta denied his indigenous heritage by producing a witness that confirmed his Spanish dress. But at the same time, that Spanish law created pathways to upward racial mobility. Sumptuary laws imposed roadblocks. For instance, Earle notes that in 16th century Mexico, Black women were prohibited from wearing gold, pearls, silk, or other luxurious goods unless married to a Spaniard. Such a law seemed intent on preserving wives as social trophies, but only for white husbands through a rationale that they should not be impeded from dressing their wives as they saw fit, showering them with jewels and enjoying their appearance simply because they were Black. Clearly, within the British Empire, no such pathways, legal or social, existed, which allowed people of African descent or Indigenous Americans to lay claim to what was considered by whites to be a higher racial identity on the basis of cultural practices like dress. Instead, the British colonial ideal of race was inextricably bound to the body, and the idea that race was biologically determined and could be visually discerned through markers like skin color, hair texture, and nose width. At the heart of Dutchess's story is the failure of white societies to see enslaved Black females as women or as feminine, that is, outside of their reproductive capacities as breeders of new enslaved people. Indeed, routinely deprived of sufficient and diversified nutrition and forced to work grueling hours at back-breaking labor, enslaved men and women across the Americas would have been customarily underweight, exceptionally muscular, and in the tropics, deeply and constantly tanned in comparison to upper-class leisurely whites. But for enslaved Black women, how the nature of their lives transformed their bodies opened a vast gulf between themselves and the ideals of white feminine beauty, which people the likes of Coldhurst understood to be natural. But Dutchess's story does not merely expose the rift between the gendered expectations and performances of middle and upper class whites and enslaved and impoverished Blacks, but the animalization of the latter by the former. The use of the terms like wool and hooves to describe the hair and feet of people of African descent was not accidental. As Coldhurst recounted, when Dutchess was forced to try on the shoes in front of the packed courthouse, those assembled, quote, shouted when the pink satins were placed upon the hoofs of Dutchess. In truth, I never saw anything as unsuitable as the satins on such feet, end quote. Coldhurst's cruelty is palpable, and we can only imagine Dutchess's utter humiliation at being the target of such public venom and ridicule. If Coldhurst is to be believed, Dutchess had a clear desire to transcend the drudgery, pain, and stark material disenfranchisement of her enslavement by acquiring beautiful clothing and jewelry with which to adorn her body. Her bid to escape, if only fleetingly, the crushing obscenity of slavery illuminates the dress norms of many Caribbean colonies like Jamaica. In the wealthy, plantation-riddled British colony, it was customary for enslaved women to be provided with once yearly rations of osnaburg, a plain woven flax fabric, which they were expected to manufacture clothing for the entire enslaved populations of their respective plantations. This labor was on top of their most common labor as agricultural field workers on the innumerable plantations, mainly cultivating sugar, which dotted the island. According to Lucille Mayer in Jamaica, quote, in 1832, sugar employed 49.5% of the slave workforce. The majority of those workers were women, the ratio being 920 males to 1,000 females, end quote. And to do this research, Mayer would have used or was using documents such as this, manuscripts that were prepared yearly by overseers to do a head count of the so-called Negroes on each plantation. And such lists usually only list the first name of the enslaved, because commonly in the British Atlantic, the last name is the name of the person who owned you. But they also list here, you'll see it's distinguishing between Creoles, people born on the island or in the Americas, and A is for Africans. And it's also listing their labor. So Mayer would have been using documents like this to discern the difference between male and female labor. So Mayer argued that the exploitative capitalist system concentrated Black enslaved women in the fields in the most menial and least versatile areas of cultivation, in excess of men and in excess of all persons, male and female, who were not Black. While the imposition of the fabric rations could have led to the homogenization of slave dress on the island, the ingenuity and resourcefulness of enslaved women resulted in much more creative outcomes. Through the production and use of dyes and perfumes made from muskwood and rosewood, and the manufacture of natural materials like lace bark from the legetto tree, enslaved Jamaicans found ways to assert their individuality through their dress cultures. Although Osnaburg fabric was also imported to Canada, unlike those held in bondage in Jamaica, enslaved Blacks in Canada wore a diverse range of clothing. Indeed, it is difficult to define a unique slave dress in Canada because slave owners routinely bestowed their secondhand clothing upon those they held in bondage. Ironically then, the slave dress of the British province of Quebec can be characterized by its lack of clear differentiation from the clothing worn by free, middle, and upper class whites. The commonality then resides not in what the enslaved wore in Quebec, but in the constant description of their clothing as old, worn, discolored, and daubed with paint. These details can be recuperated from the fugitive slave advertisements, which were routinely printed in local newspapers like the Montreal Gazette and the Quebec Gazette, when enslaved people would dare to resist their enslavement through flight. Since their impoverishment meant that they typically owned only one set of clothes, describing a fugitive's garments was akin to describing the person. Such notices are today commonly consulted by scholars seeking to recuperate details about the lives and experiences of the enslaved. In a world where slave owner control extended to cultural production and literacy was customarily forbidden, the enslaved were systematically denied the materials, time, and knowledge to leave traces of their own lives. Ironically then, the fugitive slave ads initially placed to hunt, recapture, and re-enslave people seeking their freedom have become one of the best archives for an understanding of the appearance, actions, ability, and dress of the enslaved. This because slave owners were so desperate to recuperate their missing so-called property that they were willing to disclose often invasive details, which were unhelpful in their bid to define human beings as chattel. Canadian fugitive slave notices routinely describe the clothing worn by the brave people who dared to risk their lives for freedom. While many wore typical European clothing, there are also glimpses of African cultural preservation. A fugitive slave ad placed on the 14th of May, 1767 by the Montreal vintner, James Crofton, offered the public an $8 reward besides all reasonable charges for helping to recapture a mulatto Negro slave named Andrew. Besides describing Andrew's crooked fingers, remarkably large mouth, and his facility with 4 languages, English, French, Dutch, and Ursi, Crofton intriguingly claimed that Andrew possessed forged certificates for his freedom and passes. In a special note in the advertisement, Crofton added that Andrew was, quote, remarkable for being clean dressed and wearing a handkerchief around his head, end quote. This last point refers to an African dress practice known as head wrapping. Often associated with enslaved and freed Black women in the Caribbean, head wrapping was a practice in which cloth was tied around the head for both functional and beautification purposes. The practice, widely believed to have begun in West Africa, survived the Middle Passage to be preserved and adapted by enslaved Africans and their descendants across the Americas. But head wrapping also became a tool of social distinction within Black and mixed race communities. Mainly females, both the so-called Negroes, often enslaved, and the so-called coloreds, often free, wore the African garment to adorn, protect, and demarcate their bodies within a social landscape in which complexion was not securely conflated with social status. Genre paintings set in bustling markets became a preferred theme of Agostino Brunius, who assiduously avoided the plantation. As K. Diane Chris has argued, to make visible such forced physical labor of women, even lowly African women, would reflect poorly on colonizing British. It is not surprising, therefore, that when Brunius depicts African women at work, they are shown not as field slaves, but most often as free agents in a market economy, selling produce or fresh produce grown in their provision grounds after their day's work for the master was done, end quote. Agostino Brunius's linen market, Dominica, staged the complex sexual dance between white men, white women, and Black women. In it, the centrally placed, ambiguously raced, light-skinned woman, is she mulatto or is she white, is accompanied by a pink parasol carrying Black maidservant as she engages with a seated Black woman of medium complexion who proffers a bolt of white cloth. Chris has argued that this whitish woman at the center of the scene is under intense scrutiny, including from a nearby white bewigged man intensely gripping his cane, tucked into the background behind the table of linen goods. While it is possible, if not probable, that as Chris contends, quote, his position and manner suggest that he is the woman's companion rather than a casual admirer, end quote. I disagree that the white man's piercing gaze is necessarily directed at his elaborately dressed whitish companion, her potential commercial exchange, or what Chris calls the insubordination of the parasol wielding maid. Rather, the direction of the gaze can just as easily be read as passing in front of the light-skinned female companion to land directly upon the upturned backside of a bent-over Black female, one of a group of 5 figures in the right foreground of the image. In many ways, this painting then is about the fabricated colonial hierarchies of race, class, and gender, through which the Caribbean was governed, as well as the unreliable and often unscrutable nature of vision. Brunius literally embedded the class and racial hierarchy of the island into the compositional hierarchy of his painting by placing these 5 figures, arguably the darkest people in the image and the ones most likely to be considered Negroes, closest to the ground. As such, they were meant to be read as closer to the earth and to nature and more animalistic and brutish, not only in terms of their color and dress, but in terms of their actions at the market. Of all of the many women in the scene, it is telling that only the 3 light-skinned mulattas and the indeterminately white woman are actually shopping at the market. 3 for cloth, 2 at the left near the table laden with fabric, 1 in the center at another table, and the mulatta buying an eggplant at the right side. Brunius's European and white Creole viewers, and Creole here just means any person born in a colony. So Brunius's European and white Creole viewers would have seen it fitting that the dark-skinned Black figures were selling the cheapest and most natural goods in the market. Furthermore, despite the profusion of cloth in the cut of their skirts, the wide sleeves, the checked and striped scarves, and the intricate head wraps of the gathered crowd, it is the darkest skinned Black subjects that are the most exposed. While a shirtless, barefooted Black male kneels in the right foreground, the white blouse slips off the right shoulder of a dark-skinned woman, likely enslaved, in the center of the image, almost exposing her right breast. That the upper-class white male with cane, hat, and blue jacket, from which his ruffled shirt sleeves emerge, and the century-placed white-looking woman, both standing or amongst the tallest figures in the painting, is not accidental. Their height, like their complexions, and the distinctive headwear serve to attract more attention. Furthermore, the frivolous nature of the white man's decorative sleeves and the too long and impractically colored white dress that the whitish female holds aloft with her left hand to guard it against the dirt are, through their very lack of function, demonstration of the wearer's relative wealth, upper-class status, and leisure time. In comparison, the Black female position to the left of this grouping sits on a very low stool with a parcel of corn at her left and a basket of fruit or vegetables at her right. A kneeling Black male watches as a bent over Black female handles a bunch of bananas, seemingly preoccupied with fetching him some. The Black male's low status, most likely enslaved, is also visible in his bare chest and feet. Interestingly, the kneeling Black male and the standing white one, although physically disconnected, are both absorbed in the same scene, only from different perspectives. While Brunius positioned the kneeling Black man as a legitimate client of the Black female higgler or huckster, as they were known in the Caribbean, herself also likely enslaved, it is the assumed proper upper-class white man whose devious behavior is erotically charged. Devious since, if the whitest woman was indeed his companion, he would not have wanted her to catch him in the act of perusing another woman's body in a sexual manner, and certainly not a Black woman. It is a tilt of the white man's head to the right, away from the body of his light-skinned companion, that clears a visual path for him to peer in front of her body, gaining unimpeded access to the stooping Black woman's upturned backside. Here, Brunius, himself an outsider as an Italian and a Catholic, unintentionally or perhaps not, complicated the assumed rightness of the racialized order of sexual desire by positioning a dark-skinned female slave higgler huckster as the sexual target of the elite white male, and not the supposedly beautiful, decadently dressed, light-skinned lady. Ambiguity then is not only a factor in the racial identity of the central female figure, as Chris has so ably noted, but in the glance of the white man. Is it towards his white companion or the backside of an enslaved female, which not only connotes human interaction, but sexual desire? The form of a so-called Negro woman distracts him from the supposedly irresistible charms of what Janet Shaw called his natural mate, the presumed beautiful white woman. An enslaved Black man, Andrew's preservation of the African head-wrapping tradition is particularly noteworthy, since according to Crofton, his slave owner, the 23-year-old was of mixed African and European heritage, a mulatto Negro, and was born in Maryland. As a Creole then, a person born in the Americas, Andrew was precisely the type of Black person who one might assume would have been the victim of the loss of his African culture. In the areas of the Americas where slave ships arrived from Africa, slave owners and their overseers were notorious for implementing violent measures to break newly enslaved Africans away from their cultures, languages, spiritual practices, families, and communities. Measures like the standardization of Osnaburg fabric, which I've discussed already in Jamaica, were meant to dismantle African dress practices and with it, pride in specific ethnic and national identities, to homogenize diverse populations, and to reduce humans to objects. Andrew's headwrapping does not merely reflect his own personal choices, but those of his elders and community members, the unknown people who had taught him in the midst of Maryland and Quebec slavery how to wrap his head. More evidence of the practice of head wrapping in Canada comes from a fugitive slave advertisement printed on the 18th of June, 1776 in Nova Scotia for the return of a Negro woman named Florimell. The anonymously placed notice recorded the day, June 10th, and time between the hours of 9 and 10 at night that Florimell had escaped, indicating the heightened surveillance under which she was living. While her clothing was a blend of female and male items, gown, petticoat, men's shoes, the notice also included the detail that, quote, she commonly wears a handkerchief around her head, end quote. But unlike the mixed race African-American Creole Andrew, signs point to Florimell's potential Africanness, meaning born in Africa. Besides her practice of the African dress, tradition of head wrapping, Florimell also purportedly had scars on her face and spoke broken English. Although slave owners often describe the scars which riddled an enslaved person's body from corporal punishment, harsh labor conditions, accidents, and illness, Florimell's scars may have been the product of the ritual-based community marks of scarification. In Canada, the most common marks of illness that were recalled both in slave sale and fugitive slave ads were smallpox. In the former, the slave ads, as evidence of the inoculation of the enslaved and their ability to survive the next epidemic. And in the latter, the fugitive ads, as a means of further identifying the hunted individual. But another type of mark was also commonly documented in fugitive slave ads, known as country marks by slave owners. The African cultural practice of scarification, the practice of marking the flesh in order to create aesthetic patterns with specific ethnic and community meaning, was typically outlawed within one generation of African arrival in the Americas. Florimell's facial scars may not have been from smallpox. Together with her head wrapping and broken English, an uncommon occurrence for enslaved Creoles in Canada, like Andrew, the three signs point to Florimell's likely African birth. While the American-born mixed-race Andrew and the likely African-born Florimell both exhibited retention of African dress practices, another enslaved Black Canadian who we encounter in the Fugitive Slave Archive arguably shared more with the enslaved Dutchess than either of her Canadian counterparts. Cash is described in a rather extraordinary fugitive slave ad printed on the 4th of November, 1779 by the Quebec tailor Hugh Ritchie. Under the headline "Ran Away" in the Quebec Gazette, Ritchie details his hunt for the 26-year-old fluently bilingual, English and French, Negro wench named Cash, who had escaped alongside an 18-year-old Negro lad named Nemo. What links Cash and Dutchess is the type and the amount of clothing with which she absconded. Ritchie claimed that Cash, quote, carried with her a large bundle of wearing apparel consisting of a black satin cloak, caps, bonnets, ruffles, ribbons, 6 or 7 petticoats, a pair of old stays, and many other articles of value which cannot be ascertained. Like the dress items that Dutchess was accused of purchasing with ill-gotten funds, Cash's bundle was comprised of refined pieces of middle and upper class female dress, most commonly associated at this time with white women. Also, like Dutchess then, Cash's escape forces us to think about forces us to think about her not merely as a slave, but as a person seeking her freedom, someone who understood her real value as a human and as a woman, and who thought about how she adorned her body. Cash's departure with an excessively feminine and refined bundle of clothing also speaks to Black female defiance of the flattening of gender within transatlantic slavery through the imposition of masculine labor and dress, like Florimell's men's shoes. The nature of Cash's clothing is unsurprising given Hugh Ritchie's occupation as a tailor. It is likely that the labor that he stole from Cash was related to his business and that Cash rightfully understood the clothing with which she escaped as her own. Indeed, even Ritchie conceded as much when he noted that Cash's clothing or collection of clothing belonged to herself. And this is extraordinarily rare that you find this in runaway or fugitive slave ads. It should not come then as a surprise that many Black diaspora contemporary artists have engaged with the histories and legacies of transatlantic slavery, the former, which direly impacted their ancestors, and the latter, which continue to plague Black people today. Many of the artists engage explicitly with slave dress and the racialization or racialized hierarchies of body politics, which confronted Dutchess, Andrew, Florimell, and Cash centuries ago. Born in Washington, D.C. to Jamaican and Trinidadian parents, the multimedia artist Sonia Clark often uses beads, hair, fabric, and other materials to reimagine everyday items in relation to American histories of slavery and racial injustice. Clark's heritage pearls present a necklace in an open cloth-lined jewelry box with the words "Heritage Cultured Pearls" printed on the inside of the lid. While the title of the artwork and the labeling evoke the idea of a string of beautiful white beads, the pearls that Clark invites us to contemplate are in actuality a strand of balled up pieces of dark colored African textured hair, lovingly laid out as a necklace on the cream fabric in the jewelry case. As the epithet wool indicates, Europeans and European Americans imagine their cultures and their bodies to be inherently superior to those of people of African descent. Wool, the term commonly used for the fleece produced by animals such as sheep, camels, goat, llamas, mucks, oxen, and rabbits, was weaponized within the context of slavery to denigrate Black people. The pervasive glorification of the straight, normally long and often light colored hair of white women as symbolic of feminine beauty led to disparaging comparisons with the tightly coiled, fine, sculptural, and often dark colored hair of Black women. As Graham White and Shane White have observed, slave owners were known to make degrading comments about the texture of the hair of Black people they enslaved, to refer to it as wool, and to command that those they enslaved do the same. Clark's heritage pearls upends this deep-seated racist devaluation by insisting that Black hair is not only valuable, but precious. The pearls of Black hair are not refuse to be discarded, but instead, by implication, have been painstakingly collected and manipulated into a personal treasure. Karen Jones is a Black Canadian multidisciplinary artist whose work emerges from a background in jewelry design. Like Clark, Jones' Worn from 2014-15 addresses the intersection of dress and body politics within the context of slavery. Installed at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto in 2015, the work consists of a life-size, floor-length Black mourning gown created in a refined 19th century upper-class style. Illuminated by the gown is woven from synthetic Black hair, and the floor around it was littered with fibrous cotton balls, still attached to their decaying brown leaves. Jones stuffs some of the cotton balls with her own hair. As Lou Taylor argues, Western mourning dresses were a way for upper-class white women to display their worth and rank through public performances of grief, often initiated at funerals. But the context of mourning is interrupted here by the scattered cotton balls and the Black hair. a reminder of the absent enslaved Black people who made the worlds of their white slave owners run. Grief then is literally woven from the hair of enslaved Blacks and thus references the ever-present, yet unwitnessed by whites, suffering of those who did the heavy lifting during slavery. In a disturbing aside, the Montreal-based slave owner and West Indian merchant, James Mcgill, who bequeathed 10,000 pounds and his Burnside estate to found his namesake university in Montreal in 1821, is typically lauded as a benevolent philanthropist for his bequests to various Montreal and Glasgow institutions. However, as his will also reveals, to each of the people he held in bondage, named as servants as opposed to slaves in the legal document, the wealthy Mcgill seemed to leave only a suit of mourning, presumably so that they could properly be outfitted to mourn him at his funeral. The histories of slave dress are inseparable from the identities and experiences of the enslaved, who existed within an oppressive system within which whites exerted sadistic control over all aspects of their lives. Dress then became a way to assert one's individuality and humanity, to insist that I am human and I belong to myself in a world where the enslaved were legally classed as movable personal property. The fact that Dutchess, Andrew, Florimell, and Cash affirmed both declarations is why we are able to recover their names and deeds today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charmaine. I'm sorry we've sort of been absent. I know it's difficult speaking when there's no elderly faces in front of you, but we're very much here. Yes, if people would like to raise their hands, we're seeing some applause signs in the well, I guess you could either put a question in text or raise your hand and I can unmute you, whichever you prefer.
And I could just say while we're waiting, the brilliant Victoria Lessard, who I see is here, is the reason why I have those images of the Quebec ads to show you, because Victoria did her MA at Mcgill with me. I forget now, Victoria, how many years ago it was, but Victoria was my research assistant, and you can imagine the painstaking work because all of that I'm showing you was on microfilm. So Victoria went back into the archives to digitize those images for me, which are really, really important to see the nature of that print culture at that time. And even you see some of them have specific icons in the corner, usually the top left corner. So rather than to work with transcribed documents, it's because of Victoria that I was able to collect those. So thank you, Victoria. I have not forgotten, I will never forget.
Yeah, I was wondering about that data set. It looks like a very interesting data set. We have a question from Alexandra Palmer, who I've unmuted, so she can speak if she likes. Yes. Can you unmute yourself, Alexandra? Okay, coming, I think.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Hi. Thank you. That was really fascinating, and I loved seeing the icons and everything. It was really important to understand them. I actually didn't have a question. I'm a bit in awe. I just had a thought. I believe that dress has been purchased by the Royal Ontario Museum and is in our permanent collection. It's fantastic.
Oh, fantastic. That's great news. Thank you, Alexandra.
Yeah.
I had no idea. So they purchased it after the installation. That's fantastic
because it's
news.
So great. It's really fabulous.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for letting me know that. Yes.
And a question from Betsy Harney. Are you unmuted, Betsy?
Hi. Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Betsy.
Hi, thanks so much for that, Charmaine. It was really fantastic. I had to miss the very introduction, so I'm sorry if
No
I'm asking
problem.
something that you went
No,
over, but
please
I'm
go
just
ahead.
kind of curious about the the visual history of the ads themselves and
Yes.
the dress of those figures that are always on the upper left, and
Mhm.
whether you've thought about that and what you know about that.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that question. No, I didn't address that. Thanks so much. So, if you've ever seen fugitive slave ads in the U.S. coming out of the South, they I think more often than our Canadian ones have an icon in the upper left, and we can even boil it down to two standard gendered icons: a seated Black woman for female fugitives who seems to be resting, and she has a bundle at her side, and she's running away with something bundled up in some cloth, and the Black man's usually in profile in a running pose. And I found, I think, a couple of similar of the Black man running in Canada. But then you've seen the ones I showed you here, Betsy. You see this one that really made no sense to me in the context of studying slavery. That looks like an indigenous figure with a grass skirt and a headdress. And I'm like, what is this? Because when you study the Caribbean or you study the American South, you don't, I haven't come across that yet. So a friend of mine, luckily, who studies transatlantic slavery and the visual culture of slavery, told me that he thinks it's coming from tobacco advertising. So that I
would
should
that have
look at
been like a carob kind of figure? I mean,
I'm not sure if specifically Carib or an indigenous figure. I don't know. Well, maybe an indigenous, maybe tropical America's figure that was put on tobacco advertising. And I think maybe where it's coming from, Betsy, is that I'm focusing on the Black enslaved populations, but in New France, Quebec, indigenous people were also enslaved within transatlantic or chattel slavery. And they actually made up the larger population of the enslaved. So I'm wondering if that's where it's coming from in terms of slave owners representing this idea of an indigenous person in the iconography, as opposed to their idea of whatever a Black person supposedly would look like. But there's some ads too with nothing. There's many ads in the Canadian context with no icon at all as well. So it's really, it would be interesting once we start to collect across all the provinces that practice slavery, which is Ontario eastward, when we start to see what is the archive of iconography like, and does it vary between provinces?
that's great. I mean, it's just so interesting in relation to the deep reading you're actually doing of the description of what the enslaved runaways are doing, because even they've taken the time to dress these figures in the upper
Right.
left-hand corner, whatever that
Right.
might be, right? So it's kind of interesting that's
For sure.
seems
Such
important
great.
somehow.
For sure. And we can imagine then, if you're an 18th century reader of these ads and of these newspapers, if they're constantly or frequently printing them with this indigenous, grass skirt figure, then that becomes a trigger of a way to immediately tell you this is a fugitive ad.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's what the use was. Is for me, if anyone's wondering too, why is Charmaine, an art historian, looking at these print ads? For me, when I first came across the ads in the context of working on the visual culture of slavery and working on things like oil portraits or marble sculptures, I come across these ads and I start to read them, like, they're so visual, but I mean, the text is visual. So what are they describing? They're usually describing things that someone else could see in the body of that other person, right? How tall are you? What's your body type? What's your hair texture? What are you wearing? And then secondarily, they'll say things like, oh, Andrew he's from Maryland, or he has a such and such accent. So secondarily, it's audibly like, what would I hear if I spoke to this person? So for me, I theorized that these ads are actually a form of unauthorized portraiture, and that the portrait is actually the text, and that the text required the ad to function properly, demanded that the reader translate the text into a visual image and say, oh, that person down the street, that looks like that could be Andrew. Let me go and catch him and get the money, right? But if you don't do that translation, you never catch anybody, because this is pre-photographic, of course. So that is my interest as an art historian, in what got me into being very deeply interested and intrigued by these ads, is the nature of how abundantly and dominantly visual they seem to be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting. We have a question from Kadri Jing.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm in fact, Betsy beat me to it. I was also very interested in those little figures, and it struck me that they are literally cliches, right? They are, printers stereotypes. And I guess, like, I mean, I had all the same questions as Betsy, but I was also kind of wondering, maybe as you're trying to uncover a sort of deeper history of these, whether it might be interesting to try and find out whether, in fact, people paid more to have that little attention-getting thing in the corner. But also, I mean, it really struck me that there's such a distinction between the cliche nature of these images and the detailed personal description.
Yes.
Right. And so there's a way, I mean, I think it goes to the way that slavery operated, right? How it became possible, because you always need this, a dehumanizing, stereotyping, literally and metaphorically, image that perhaps prevails over this actually, as you say, a kind of humanizing description of the person, the individual, right? Anyway, so that was just my my further thoughts on that. But my question actually has to do with the very interesting connection you make between the sort of tropes of animality and of these descriptions of people's hair in particular. And I was just thinking, I was reminded actually of, the Shakespeare sonnet, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, which is supposed to be about a Black woman. And in that, at some point, he says, if hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. Right? So that's a different trope entirely. So I'm just wondering, is there some kind of epistemological shift that happens, right? I mean, maybe there's a deeper genealogy to the kind of descriptions that are attributed to the hair.
Right.
Have you thought about that, or
Right. Thank you for both.
Thank
you so much for both points. To the first point, yes, absolutely. There's a bizarre thing happening, of course, because the icons are so flat and so they're stereotypes, right? They're straight up stereotypes, and then the ads themselves are about. They recognize, obviously, if I do not individualize this person, I will never catch them.
Right.
And then the part of it too, that's seriously, the part that's really bizarre is the way they individualize them too. Like Crofton says, Andrew is speaking 4 languages. Okay.
Right.
But then you want to pretend that you have to civilize Africans. You need to civilize them. And then if you think about someone like Florimell, who might have been African born, how many languages would she have had before ending up in Halifax? And if we can think too, no slave ships went straight from the west coast of Africa to Halifax. So Florimell would have been disembarked somewhere else first. So what else did she learn in those other points of disembarkation before she was then put on another ship or forced to go inland up to Halifax? So how many languages did she have that slave owner doesn't even bother to name because he can't understand them, right? Because slave owners in Canada too typically didn't understand Africanness. So they never name specific African ethnicities, for instance. But what they do name then is so detailed, like what they're wearing, how they move, mannerisms, all these things, that it totally defeats the purpose of them trying to convince everybody that slavery is a necessary civilizing mission, right? And in the end, what happens, of course, we know is that abolitionists take fugitive slave ads and they begin to reprint them verbatim. They don't change a word. And they say, like, look at this. This is not a civilizing mission. This is some rubbish. It needs to end. And also too, because the slave ads too, not just with the individualization, but they commonly would represent the nature of the horrific violence that marked the bodies of the enslaved. So they'd say things like, this person is branded with my initials, or this person has whip marks on their legs. And the Canadian ones too, sometimes, you know, they mention a lot of scars, deformities, missing limbs, missing toes, digits, etc. But to the point about animality and hair, you know, I think the way I think about it too is that animality, or the reduction of Black Africans to chattel status, that is what underpins the whole enterprise of slavery. So if you think about it, every moment in the regional movement of enslaved people, there's a name that is forced upon the enslaved that signals the reduction to non-humanness. So when you're a captive in Africa and they throw you on the ship, you are literally in those ledgers that we can recuperate from the slave ships, you're not even a name. Nobody has a name. You're a head count of how many men, how many women, how many girls, and how many boys. Nobody has a name. And you literally are a cargo, and you are insured as a cargo. So that if anyone is lost on the ship, meaning you die of dysentery, or they kill you during a rebellion, or you commit suicide, or someone throws you overboard, which we all know happened, if any of that happens, that captain and that slave owner who owns the ship, the ship owner, will get money back for you. So you go from being cargo, if you make it to the Americas, and the first thing they do to you is rename you. They strip your African name, they impose a European one. Your last name by default is the family name of the slave owner, right? So you become then this object again, right? And you're at that point again, chattel, you're movable personal property. And you're treated as such then in terms of how you enter the archive. So this animalization in terms of hair and body and that, it just fits with the whole nature of what slavery intended to do, which was to constantly prove that the dehumanization of Africans was justified. But what's an interesting thing there too, as I can point out, is there's increasing evidence too that as people like Andrew, the mixed race people, of course there's an explosion of this, because I should point out, if in case everybody's not on the same page about this, but what makes transatlantic slavery so unique and so horrific is that it's the first race-based form of slavery. The only group of people that were always allowed to be enslaved were Black Africans. And it was also deliberately designed in a matrilineal order, so that enslaved Black women, regardless of the father, the status or the race of the father, to get enslaved a female pregnant was for you as a one who owned her to have more property, because you own her child. So when you have the explosion of mulattoes, mulatto Negroes, quadroons, octoroons like Andrew, of course, the Black people start to look more and more like the white people because they are part white. But you have all this archival evidence of white women, especially in conflict with mixed race Black women, because they understand how beautiful their husbands perceive them to be. And they, instead of taking out that retribution on the husbands who are sexually coercing and raping these Black women, they take that venom out on the Black women. And one of the ways they do that is through the hair, meaning one of the acts of punishment that becomes normative is head shaving, and head shaving by white women of Black women. And often when the Black women's hair approximated their own hair is when they'd shave their head. So this issue of animalization, hair, Black body, there's a lot there, but a part of it for me is the underpinning of what slavery attempted to do. And to justify enslavement, you have to render this group of people less than human. And one of the ways you do that is to equate them with animals.
Right. So I guess, I mean, where I was going with that was, and what you have sort of made clear so eloquently, is that it was actually an active project, right?
Yes,
Of changing the narrative, in fact, from something that perhaps, you know, for someone like Shakespeare, he might have been approaching it in a more kind of egalitarian way. I mean, after all, this woman is his mistress, who he's writing about. So he's not calling it wool,
no,
hair, right? I guess so. I mean, it just goes to how, what a project this was.
Yes. And what, to your point, what does it take to sustain this for 400 years?
Right.
What, like, really 400 years, my friends? Like, this is really? Like when you actually learn what slavery was, and then you understand it was 400 years, you're like, how did we do this to human beings for 400 years?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why was there never at an earlier point large enough consensus of people to say this is so obviously wrong, right? So, but it's because everything in that society, in the culture, in the politics was having to do the work of justifying the enslavement of this group of people.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We have a question from Alistair now, and then I'll take a look at the chat after that for questions. Alistair.
Yes, can you hear me?
Hi, Alistair.
Hi. A quick observation and a very short question. I think that the material aspirations of Dutchess was not inconsistent with her name.
Okay.
I mean, it's a titled name, Dutchess, and wanting to dress the part wouldn't be inappropriate in her own mind, I'm thinking. But this, I think, it was fairly common, wasn't it, to give these kinds of titled names to property?
It was common for not necessarily titled names. I haven't come across as much, Alistair. I'm sure sometimes, but names of heroic names that signified strength or power. So you find an awful lot of Black enslaved men named Caesar or Hercules, right? And a part of that is I think the humiliation that white people knew that Black people would suffer, that were having to live with a name that was so different from their status, their social status. Because yeah, you find a lot of names that are just horrific too. Like I was dealing with Antiguan, so the Caribbean island nation of Antigua, their yearly plantation head counts of enslaved Black people. And I was finding the name monkey all over the place. Like they were naming enslaved people monkey and naming enslaved people trash. So you find it at both poles. Like what is the most humiliating name possible and what is the most esteemed name possible? But I get your point about Dutchess. Yeah, perhaps that's something that's going on. But the other thing too is it was typical to name horses Dutchess. So how much was it the slave owner or the overseer naming her Dutchess in terms of like, ha ha ha, she has a name that we give to a horse?
Good Lord.
Right? So that's another thing we have to think about. Yeah.
Thank you. And here's my tiny little question. Do you think this animalization that we've been talking about is leaving our social and academic discourse, or is it more palatably adjusted to the point of being overlooked in our discipline?
You mean specifically in art history or just in contemporary society?
Both.
Well, I think, okay, well, listen, as Black people in North America or in different Western countries, or even not Western countries, we know that we are still targets in terms of our bodies and their perceived difference from the supposed norm of whiteness. So for instance, not too long ago in Montreal, I think 2020, there was a legal case of a young Black woman who thankfully was fighting this, but she went to work at a restaurant downtown Montreal, I believe, and she had her hair braided, and the manager sent her home, said your hair is inappropriate. You should have seen how beautiful her braids were, by the way, because her mother was a hairdresser. So her hair was stunning, but to the white female manager, she was like, not having it, you look too Black. You look too African, you're out of here, or you're not, you go change your hair, you're not working. So luckily that woman went and got some legal advice and sued them, right? But we know that's happening all over the place. It happens with Black children in school being sent home by teachers or principals. It happens especially too, not just with braids, with people like me who choose to put their hair in locks. I mean, for a long time, good luck to you getting a job if your hair was like this, because anything that's natural hairstyle, Alistair, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just for Black women, it's for Black men as well. So I think we're still totally confronted by that, because the misperception, especially with something like locks, okay, can I break this down for people who don't understand? But for things like locks too, no, right? Because things like locks, what happens is there's a segment of white youth, especially in the teenage years or in, let's say, your undergrad degree, there's a lot of white kids or young adults who will try to lock their hair or to, get extensions that look like locks. Okay, this white people basically with straight hair cannot, you know, their hair doesn't lock. Your hair texture will not allow you to lock your hair. So what happens is these white people end up not washing their hair, okay? In order to try to get some semblance of a lock going. Whereas for our hair, you know, for a lot of us, if the hair is really beautifully coiled and curly, you twist it 2 times, it's like, okay, done, okay? So the question of can you lock your hair as a Black person also be hygienic is not an issue. But what happens is because so many white people might not have contact with people like us or people like me who have locks that are clean and beautiful and washed, they see me and they go, whoa, she has this type of hair, she must not wash herself. And it's like, can you hold up a second? This is a Black hair aesthetic. Go learn something, go read a book. And don't put on me what's happening with white youth who appropriate this hairstyle imperfectly because they have the wrong hair texture, and then, you know, do things like not wash their hair for 2 months. So this is part of the disconnect too. In that part of it is like, are we actually living together? How much do white people actually understand or want to understand about the specificity of Black bodies? And then how much are we still grappling with then the dominant kind of, the dominant assertion of this idea that the white body is always the one that's most aesthetically pleasing and the one that's most universal or normative. Like, when are we going to stop that? Right? Sure. So that the Blackness that gets mainstream is always the Blackness that looks most like whiteness. Right? And if you look at Hollywood, you know what I'm talking about. So I think that's part of that is what's happening. But still, Alistair, I know you know too, in the realm of Black hair, like, is happening all the time still in terms of the nonsense that we put up with from white institutions in terms of their misreading and lack of knowledge about our bodies, especially our hair and our practices of grooming, which are, can I say, extraordinary? Like you know, the kind of money that Black people spend on their hair, like, okay? Like, seriously, even the pandemic, everything else is done, everything else stops, but try to stop a Black woman from spending money on her hair, okay? And part of it too is because the cultures, and no joke here, but the cultures of Black hair are communal cultures, right? Like, we grow up as little Black girls sitting between our mother's legs and them braiding our hair, right? It's a ritual. And so many Black men don't just go to a barbershop, let's say, to cut their hair, they go to a barbershop to get shaved. And it's a ritual, like, you do it every Saturday, because not just because of the shave and the haircut, but because you need to be with your fellow Black men and what happens in that barbershop. So, you know, all that too is something that not necessarily white community and white individuals understand about us, right? So it's a lot of it is a misperception, but then what they put on us is what becomes dangerous. So thank you so much for that, Alistair.
And thank you.
Great, thanks very much. There's a question in the chat here. Have you noticed that any colors predominate in enslaved people's dress?
Wow, that's great, Jonathan. That's so interesting. Okay, so you know what? In the Canadian context, no. And I think part of that is that you'll notice in the ads I showed you, the clothing is discolored. And I think that's because it's almost always secondhand. That's my theory. So that a lot of times it's like they're describing a color, and sometimes they're saying it's just old and it's just worn. So I don't think there's dominant colors, but I've come across really beautiful, like, kind of startling colors for women, like purple and red. So, but again, I don't know if that's you know, Jonathan, their choice or the choice of the owner who's giving them hand-me-downs. In the case of a place like Jamaica, I have to rethink it because they're, of course, enslaved are making their own clothing by and large. So if I start to find certain color practices there, I know it's more attributable to the enslaved women who are made to manufacture the clothes. And then a brilliant scholar like Buckridge, who works on, Steve Buckridge works on slave dress in Jamaica. He talks about deep-seated practices of dyeing and perfuming the Osterberg fabric. So the thing too we had to think about too, you know, Jonathan, is like, okay, in this world where you're supposedly an animal and your slave owner and the overseer wants you to believe that about yourself, and they're giving you backbreaking labor that's way beyond normal capacity in terms of how many hours a day you're working. Your one day off is like Sunday, where you have to do everything else, including all of the self-care, right? And your provision grounds. A place like Jamaica, you're made to grow your own food. the obscenity of that. Yes, grow your own food. So you had to have a little patch of land and grow whatever your yam plant and all that. And all of that, you're going to take the time to go and make clothing and dye it and perfume it. So we got to think, like, what did this mean to them? And that's why I talk about the assertion of self-determination and self-care and self-love in these practices, no doubt. Or you'd be just like, give me the fabric, stitch it together, put it on. Who's going to bother to dye and perfume it other than someone who actually really cares and sees it as a way to assert their humanity, is my line of thinking anyway. Thank you, Jonathan.
I have a quick question as an archaeologist and
Sure.
thinking about material culture, and you know, if one puts things in the terms of material culture, we're talking about, you know, mostly items to do with personal adornment, I guess.
Yes.
And I have a distant memory, having read it a long time ago, of some work on ceramics, on pottery in I think, you know, recovered archaeologically in, I think, Jamaican plantations. I think a guy called Hauser, and looking at what kinds of ceramics were being consumed and how they were being consumed in different kinds of settings.
Right.
And I think talking about, you know, circulation and access to local earthenwares, maybe as opposed to European porcelain, I'm not too sure.
Wow. Okay.
So I guess that's a different aspect of identity that's maybe it's a little bit more communal if one's thinking about shared meals or something like that. I have no idea about late 18th century Quebec and what archaeological finds there have been, and I don't know how much these different sorts of research intersect.
Right.
You know, sort of documentary, historical, art historical, archaeological. So just throw that out there and see if you.
No, thank you so much. It's so important what you're saying, because, okay, when we're thinking as scholars who work on slavery, part of the difficulty is trying ever to recuperate sources or objects or materials that were produced by the enslaved. Sadly, the dominant way that people like me learn about the enslaved is through the words or the traces left by the people who owned them. Why? One of the things is that pervasively across the Americas, enslaved people were not allowed to learn to read and write. Like it was either in the law or was just a known prohibition. So, you know, someone like a Frederick Douglass, the African-American self-liberated, you know, formerly enslaved person who goes on to be like a newspaper editor and founder and statesman, is like, there's like one Frederick Douglass, okay? Like Frederick Douglass, who ends up writing 3 autobiographies, that's like just not normal amongst enslaved people, right? Like you might get one slave narrative if you're lucky. And many of those slave narratives were dictated to an abolitionist, a white abolitionist, who then was the one who wrote it up. So to your point, another case of really important materials we should be looking for more often are archaeological items, because that's where too, if we are lucky and we have specific sites with good deposits, we'd find material culture left by the enslaved, right? And something comes to mind too is in burial grounds and things like that. And if you recall, when they were putting up a specific, I forget the name of the building, but a federal building in Wall Street in the 90s, right, New York City, they stopped digging because they hit human remains. And they turned out to be remains, I think, from the 1700s. It was a slave burial ground. And just what you're saying there, they found all these different objects, clothing, materials, amulets, et cetera, that were buried with the enslaved. So they were able to speak to about practices of African spirituality and religion that survived the Middle Passage, that were being continued in a creolized fashion by those enslaved African Americans then. So what you're saying is so important, so powerful. But can I tell you, what we're dealing with in terms of study of Canadian slavery, because you said what would exist in a place like Quebec, what we're dealing with is there's only about 5 scholars like myself who have a job at a Canadian university who have enough knowledge of Canadian slavery that we're teaching Canadian slavery and supervising grad students, just about 5 of us. And James Walker just retired from Waterloo. Okay, so there's so few of us, and our access to supervisees then is so small that archaeology, I know of one professional archaeologist, Carolyn Smarts Frost, who specializes in Canadian slavery, right? I'm at the moment the only Canadianist art historian who specializes in Canadian slavery, right? The other 3 or 4 are historians. So what you're saying is right, it's there. Of course, we'd have it in Canada too, because we had segregated burial practices, for instance, in Canada. So even though we didn't have slave majorities, there would be ways for us to find exactly what you're talking about, material culture deposits. Who has the knowledge to go do it? Who's training the people to have the knowledge to go do it? So that's part of the battle we're up against. And can I say that's just why I wanted to found an institute for the study of Canadian slavery, because we're sitting on a 200-year history that, what, 5 people are going to do research on his history across like 5 provinces, really? So there's so much to do, and there's not enough boots on the ground. But thank you so much for that. And there will be a lot there. And can I just say, as an example, I was privileged to give a lecture in Medford, Massachusetts they claim to be a museum that, they're probably right, the only surviving, what do they call it? Slave quarters in the American North. Okay, because usually slave quarters, you just have them in the South, in the tropics, because that's where you had enslaved majorities. So Medford, Massachusetts, they have this museum, which is a former home of these slave owners, and they preserve the slave quarters. They did an archaeological dig there beside the slave quarters. Interestingly, on the side of the slave quarters, facing away from the house, where the master and mistress could not see them through the windows, they found all kinds of things, including games, toys, right? Different household objects, ceramics, like you say. So, you know, it's just for us to have the people to do the looking and to know where to look. But right now, it's not, we don't have enough people doing that, and we don't have enough people spread out in enough disciplines and specializations. But that's a brilliant question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I recall a study along those lines. That was like phrased in terms of resistance, I think. But I often forget, because I'd studied prehistory, I sometimes forget that there's this notion that of visible evidence and invisible evidence, because I don't have any texts, so I suppose I'm always dealing with the invisible traces and what's invisible. So
and then those of us who are later, we're like, where's the object, or where's the document, right? And then you're right, what has survived becomes another question.
But then everything else becomes somehow invisible.
Right.
Let me just check. I think I saw some comments rather than questions in the chat, but let me just check. Alexandra Palmer has a comment. Maybe I can just read that. The many newspaper descriptions of stolen clothes and lost items and rewards, as well as adverts for sales of all chattels throughout the 18th century, is a very detailed language that is well understood. 18th century readers were very able to translate text to visual objects they might see to get a reward. The slave descriptions follow this language, in my opinion.
Okay, so you're thinking this is coming. Okay. Interesting. Okay.
And then Adam sings your praises and says that when he's taught the Canadian painting course, started by reading your Canadian Women Studies article.
Thank you, Adam. Adam was my former colleague at Mcgill. When he was a librarian there. So it's nice to see Adam here. Hi, Adam. Thanks for that. And then
thanks, William, for the stimulating lecture. And there's, we maybe have lost the thread of this. Alison Matthews, David, hence perhaps the hoof reference. I guess that was with the discussion of Dutchess and...
Okay, yes. So that's another form, of course, of the animalization. Can I just point out too, with the hoofs, part of what's going on there too, which might not be obvious to everybody, in a place like Canada, where you have distinct seasons and really cold winters, what you find in the ads, of course, for instance, Florimell had men's boots. So slave owners had to give their enslaved people a proper seasonal footwear, or you're going to kill them. Right there, and you actually have some ads that say, there's an ad that's stuck in my brain, and a slave man named Charles, I believe, who the slave owner describes as missing the ends of both his great toes, and he specifically says it's due to frostbite. So take us down to St. Vincent or Jamaica. one of the stigmatizing signs of slave status was shoelessness. So slave owners are saying, here's some Osnaburg fabric, that's it. So if you're escaping that context too, you have to imagine the first thing you're going to want to do is get you some shoes, or you cannot pass yourself off as a free Black person. So to that point about the hooves, part of it, we have to think of, like, if you're working day in and day out from like age 4 or 6 in a sugarcane field, what do your feet become in terms of calluses, bruises? And there was a specific insect, I think there still is in the context like Jamaica, called chiga, that was known to bore into the hooves of animals or into the feet of human beings and lay eggs. So you hear too about all these disease-ridden feet. And if you don't pick the chiga out really quickly, they lay eggs in your foot, and then you have all these types of foot disease then, and foot disabilities amongst enslaved people. So in terms of the hoof reference too, what Coulthurst is getting at there too is that, again, the bodies of enslaved people and enslaved women would not have looked to his eyes womanly at all, because of the nature of the labor, the lack of nutrition, and can I just point out too, again, maybe not obvious, slave owners are not feeding enslaved people the best food. They're feeding them usually just cheap carbohydrates, whatever that means in that specific context. So in a place like the American South, it becomes corn, right? And in a place like Jamaica, they're eating a lot of yams and a lot of starchy food, but mainly what they're dying to get their hands on is protein, and protein in the form of fish or meat. So if you think about, the cuisine of the Caribbean, right? We eat things like, my parents are Jamaican, we eat oxtail stew. Where does that come from? That was slave food, right? So the refuse of the animal that the whites would not eat, because you don't eat the ox's tail, the enslaved people go dig that out of the garbage and make a stew out of it, right? So today that's cuisine, but where did it come from? It came from our ancestors having to get their protein from these refused sources that like the cow's foot, the chicken feet, etc. So that is the context of that too. But I want to point out the hoof reference is about too the damage that would have occurred in terms of the appearance of enslaved people's feet, in terms of the state of being shoeless, in terms of the context of that labor and abuse.
And I haven't read enough on this recently, or anything on this recently, but there's, osteological evidence from archaeological excavation and burials can do incredible, there's incredible stuff can be done now on paleopathology and isotopic work for diet. So there might well have been such work.
Right, in the context of slavery, right?
I just don't know, methodologically it's possible, but I don't know what's been done, but I will look.
For sure. No, I want to follow that up too. There's some interesting research I read years ago that was hypothesizing that even if you think about it, the rate of hypertension in not just African Americans, but Blacks in diaspora compared to, let's say, white people in the same regions, is attributed by some human scientists who study, biologists who study slavery, to the fact that the enslaved people who were on the slave ships, who survived the slave ships, were the ones who could retain salt. Because one of the pervasive diseases that spread through the cargo hold where the enslaved were held was dysentery. So the people who lost salt were the people who died in those conditions. So then the people who make it to the Americas, who go on, the 12 million, who go on to have the subsequent generations, and it becomes people like myself, were the people who could retain salt, and they pass that trait down. So yes, there's people studying this too. It's really actually fascinating how many different permutations of disciplines and fields are studying transatlantic slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, I think we've had a great discussion. I don't see any more questions. I don't think I'm missing anyone. Thank you so much. That was really, really fabulous. And thank you to everyone who took part. And I wish you all a wonderful weekend. Charmaine, thank you.
Thank you
so
very,
much
very
again.
much. Thank you. I really appreciate your all being here at this hour and your wonderful questions and support. I appreciate it. Can I just say too, we're launching the Institute at NASCAD, and I'm hoping to have a suite of fellowships to welcome students right from undergrads doing honors papers, MAs, MFAs, artists in residence, and wonderful fellows like to do postdocs. So please keep an eye on our soon to come website. And I hope some of you will be joining us out in Halifax, in sunny Halifax one day. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much.
Appreciate it. Have a great night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.